Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Lineup, where we look at world events in light of Bible prophecy. I'm Barry Stagner, and today is June the 10th, 2021, and looking forward to the many things we are going to discuss this week. And again, thank you all for checking in last week as we had our first program and a very positive response. So thank you for that. And also, we're a little more dialed in this week technologically, as I mentioned in the little teaser we did yesterday. And thank you for your patience with that. We've got some really interesting things happening around the world. Things, obviously, as we mentioned last week, that are centered on the Middle East, things that are happening around the world in other realms of Bible prophecy as well. And today we're going to, again, kind of look outside the city walls of Jerusalem, so to speak, and the events that are taking place there. But we are going to start there again with a couple of stories that we mentioned last week that are kind of coming to pass, so to speak. And they do have prophetic implications, while they may not directly be prophetic in nature. Now, interestingly, we see from the Times of Israel what we talked about last week in this coalition of members of Knesset who have had basically as their main and primary goal the ouster of Benjamin Netanyahu after his 12-year stay as prime minister in the nation of Israel, the longest running prime minister in the nation's history. And the Times of Israel is saying that the swearing in of the Bennett-Lapid government that would replace Netanyahu is set for Sunday. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu looks, the article says, to end his 12 consecutive years in power in just a few days, as Knesset Speaker Yariv Levin announced Tuesday that a vote would be held in swearing in the new, get this, change government during a special parliamentary session on Sunday, a day before the deadline set by law. And the eight-party Change Government Alliance, headed by Prime Minister-designate Naftali Bennett and Yesh Atid leader Yair Lapid, anticipates winning a 61-59 majority in the vote after a wavering Yamina MK Nir Orbach said Tuesday he would now back the new coalition. And the timing of the vote means that all coalition agreements have to be formally handed to the Knesset by Friday. And the pro-Netanyahu bloc will therefore have 48 hours, not the typical 24 hours required by law, since the Sabbath rest is not counted as a day, to scrutinize the agreements and pressure right-wing MKs to jump ship before the vote of confidence, and the voting process will begin 4 p.m. on Sunday. Now, we mentioned last week that there are pushes against anyone who is of a nationalist flavor in their political ideology, those who want to advance their own nation, protect their own nation, and not buy into the globalism that the Antichrist is someday going to lead. And we see now this shakeup going on in Israel that we have just experienced here in the United States. And on top of that, there's another story I want to follow up with that comes from the Associated Press. And the headline reads, "A lot of anxiety for Democrats as Biden agenda stalls." Now, hopes for a big infrastructure investment are teetering, the article says. An ambitious elections and voting bill is all but dead. Legislation on police brutality, gun control, and immigration is stalled out. And after 6 months of Democratic control in Washington, the party's progressive wing is growing increasingly restless as campaign promises go undone, blocked not only by Republican obstruction, but also by Democrats' own ability to unite fully around priorities. And the time ahead is pivotal for President Joe Biden and his allies in Congress to seize what some view as a transformative moment to rebuild the economy and reshape the country. And Representative Ro Khanna, a Democrat from California, said there's a lot of anxiety, as she had been the co-chair for Bernie Sanders' presidential bid. It's really a question for President Biden. What kind of president does he want to be? And she goes on to say that they're risking losing the backing of people for an entire generation, or I'm sorry, entire decade. So there's angst in Washington, as there always is under any particular administration. But it just tells us the attitude of people that we mentioned last week. People want peace and security. People want stability. People are tired of all the bickering, even though we have a hugely polarized nation and world. People just want peace, and they want it at any price. And it doesn't matter at what expense or at whose cost, as we see that happened here in the last U.S. election. And now we see the same type of thing forming with the parliamentary elections in Israel. Now, here's another story that'll wrap up the three we'll talk about concerning the issue we addressed last week and the instability that leads to a world that's open to a single world rulership of the Antichrist, or more properly, the beast of Revelation chapter 13. This story comes from Fox News, and the headline reads, "Two senators are requesting travel records of Supreme Court justices as part of a larger ethics investigation." Now, this bipartisan pair of senators, aren't we all? Senators are seeking travel documents for the Supreme Court justices as they question whether the High Court needs better transparency requirements. Senator Sheldon Whitehouse, a Democrat from Rhode Island, and John Kennedy, a Republican from Louisiana, sent a letter dated Friday requesting travel records for all Supreme Court justice trips outside of Washington, D.C., dating all the way back to January 1 of 2011. They're looking for a 10-year travel record of the members of the Supreme Court, including the names of the justices who traveled, the location they arrived at, and the cost for security for those trips over that decade. The senators, both members of the Senate Judiciary Committee, say they are reviewing financial disclosure standards for the receipt of gifts and travel by senior government officials, including judges, under the Ethics in Government Act of 1978 and the Ethics Reform Act of 1989, and they raise concerns that members of the judiciary have far less stringent rules on financial disclosures than members of Congress and the executive branch, with the 9 Supreme Court justices especially facing little scrutiny. And the article concludes by saying the judicial branch's comparable guidelines are significantly less stringent, Whitehouse and Kennedy said in the letter. Even those requirements, however, do not formally apply to the justices of the Supreme Court. And as a result, the justices of our highest court in the land are subject to the lowest standards of transparency of any senior officials across the federal government. Now, if we pair our last story with this story, we know that there's been a lot of talk about packing the Supreme Court, adding additional justices, and changing the number of the Supreme Court justices to really an unmentioned number, just enough to give the Democrats or the liberals majority once again in the Supreme Court. But it's curious that now we're seeing kind of like a funnel, as you see when something goes down a funnel. It starts at the top and it's broad, and then the funnel narrows down, and then finally it gets down to the one point where whatever the substance is actually passes through the funnel. And really, this is what we've been watching in the grand scheme of the politics of the world, the geopolitical arena, if you will. We've seen this collective movement around the world. Then we've seen a number of nations rise to power and take center stage in the world theme and the atmosphere and climate politically, ideologically too, of the world. And now we're seeing the world getting down to that point where it's going to funnel down to one person being in control. And this is part of that, the precursors to that man of sin rising to power, because it's a matter of control. There are those who want to see the Supreme Court under the control of the Congress and the Senate. And according to our Constitution, they actually are. As a matter of fact, the Supreme Court building, or the Supreme Court offices, used to be right outside the Senate and congressional halls, as kind of a figurative reminder that they sit under the review of Congress and of the Senate. And it's Congress who makes law, and the Supreme Court actually interprets law. They cannot write law or pass law, yet we've seen judicial activism. And so we have people in places of power trying to bring the Supreme Court under control. And we've got a small group of people. And even though the motivation may be masked behind financial accountability, and that's a good thing, there's no question about that, we do know it just points our minds and our thinking back to the fact that there's going to be a limited number of people in power in the tribulation period. There are going to be cohorts to the Antichrist. He's going to be the ultimate man of power, and he'll be seconded by the false prophet, the Antichrist being called the man of sin or the son of perdition, and then the false prophet who performs lying signs and wonders within his sight. So we see ourselves headed in this way to a power grab on a global scale by relatively few people in number, including in our own country. And one of the things I thought that was interesting about our first three stories, if we compile them together, is first of all, Proverbs 24, 21, and 22 says, "My son," and this is Solomon writing, the wisest man who's ever lived, "fear the Lord and the king. Do not associate with those given to change. For their calamity will rise suddenly, and who knows what ruin those two can bring," those who want to bring about change and the changes they bring about. Now, this reminds me, and some have said that Joe Biden is nothing more than Barack Obama 3.0, the third term of President Obama. But if you remember back to 2008, he had in his campaign slogans the phrase, "I want to fundamentally change America." And now here we see a party that's called the Change Party, 8 different portions of the Knesset and the different groups that make it up, now cooperating together for the single cause of ousting Benjamin Netanyahu. And we saw the same unity, if you will, happen here in the United States, where Trump had to go. He was a nationalist. He was holding back the globalist agenda. And this, no question, with the Supreme Court, is again trying to bring them under power and under scrutiny, if you will, by dealing with this particular issue and that of financial transparency. And I think that's interesting in light of the fact that they said they have to have the names of those who traveled. Now, the reason, and that's kind of a no-brainer, but I think the motive behind it is what's curious, is because it is quite likely and even probable, I dare say, that they want to know who they can get something against. Because oddly, the Supreme Court has, basically been running this country to a degree for a while. They've not been just interpreting laws. They've been writing laws and rewriting laws. And the judicial activism we talked about a few moments ago has been rampant and dominant in these last days. But this is a constitutional departure because we have to remember in this country and others around the world, the Supreme Court of any given nation is there to interpret law. As we said a moment ago, they're not there to write law. Our Supreme Court is not there to write law. That's not their job. And in this country, they give opinions, and the Congress is supposed to review those opinions. It's not the final word. The Supreme Court is not the final word. The final word is supposed to go to the Congress, but the Supreme Court has kind of taken a place of power that the Constitution did not provide for, nor does it protect. And they're basically telling everybody what they can do and what they can't do. And there are those in power who want to take that back and make sure that it stays within the group of leaders in D.C. And this interesting that this is a bipartisan issue. So we've seen in these last hearings regarding the confirmation of a particular Supreme Court justice, how so many things that have nothing to do with their capabilities or ability to do the job have made their way to the forefront and become the central figure of discussion rather than what ought to really be discussed. And therefore, there are those in power who want to see that change, and they'll use basically strong-arm tactics to do so. Now, here's the story I mentioned yesterday. There's something interesting happening in Saudi Arabia that I thought was very, very curious, and it relates to the Ezekiel 38 war scenario. And of course, we're going to be talking about that regularly because it's an unfulfilled prophecy. We can't talk about Ezekiel 37 now in the sense of prophecy because, in a sense, it's now history, even though there are still those making aliyah, those coming back to the land of Israel. The nation has been born in a day. The desert is blossoming and blooming like a rose. God is drawing his people back from the nations that they have been scattered. So really, it's a 73-year-old prophetic fulfillment. As I said, even though we're still seeing the return of the Jews back to the land of promise. But there's something else that's interesting that is taking place in the Ezekiel 38 scenario. And this actually comes from Al Jazeera, an Arabic printed paper that is common throughout the Middle East. And there's also an English-speaking version, obviously. And the headline reads, "Times have changed. Saudi Arabia and Syria are in rapprochement talks." Saudi Arabia is close to reaching an agreement on diplomatic normalization with President Bashar al-Assad's government as Riyadh jockeys to play a lead role in removing the Iranian presence from Syria. Al Jazeera has been told by those with clear knowledge of the discussions. And according to a senior official from the Syrian opposition Free Officers Movement, who maintains close contacts with the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs and General Intelligence Directorate, or the GID, the political mood within the House of Saud has changed. Many senior royals, particularly Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS as he's referred to, are keen to re-engage with Assad. And the prevailing attitude can be defined as times have changed. The Arab Spring is history, and the region is transitioning towards a new future with new geopolitical characteristics. The official, who himself recently reconciled with Damascus after defecting to the Syrian opposition in the summer of 2011, added, "The discussion with Al Jazeera came on the heels of a report in early May which claimed Riyadh had dispatched an intelligence delegation led by the GID, or the General Intelligence Directorate." Now, here's why this is interesting. One of the more curious elements of the Ezekiel war scenario is that you don't find two of the main players in the initial battles over the nation of Israel, including the day in which the nation was founded. You found Syrian and Egyptian forces heavily involved in the attacks on Israel, and yet neither of those two are mentioned in the Ezekiel war scenario. It's also worth noting that you have Sheba and Dedan, who are mentioned as the protesters, the only protesters to the invasion from the north of the coalition forces that has already formed and has a presence there on the north boundary of Israel within Syria. So you've got the Saudis, or the Arab Gulf states, protesting this invasion, and you've got the absence of Syria within the invading forces. And again, it's curious that this article says, and MBS, or Mohammed bin Salman, assured Syria that he doesn't want regime change against Bashar, and he wants to treat them as a brotherly Arab nation. And they should therefore, according to this article in Al Jazeera, the Syrians should naturally have close ties with Saudi Arabia, the founding place of Islam. So here you've got diplomatic relations being restored between a nation who's long played a part in invasions of Israel or wars against Israel, and now they're found to be absent in the war scenario of Ezekiel 38 and 39. And then you've got the protesting nation, the primary one, at least, in the Ezekiel war scenario, making overtures towards Syria. So it's very interesting to see these particular elements line up. And they may be minute, but I think they're major in the sense that we're kind of at the home stretch, so to speak, of the Ezekiel war scenario. When you've got Russian forces, Turkish forces, Iranian forces lining up, three of the three main players in the Ezekiel invasion scenario, when you've got them already with a physical presence, a military presence on the ground north of that particular invasion point, and then you've got the Saudis and Syria, who's not going to play a role, and some have conjectured that it's likely because there's such a mess with this decade-plus-long civil war. But it's possible that they could take the very attitude that Mohammed bin Salman has been introducing into his own country and the rest of the Middle East, or much of the Middle East, and certainly the Arab world as well, and that is that things are changing and times have changed, and we need to change with them. And, you know, if you look at the history of Mohammed bin Salman's presence in Saudi Arabia, it's been amazing to see how this man, this young man, I think when he was first rose to a place of prominence and was nationally recognized as the crown prince, that he began to make changes within the country right away, including things like allowing women to drive, which happened in 2018. Then also they've opened up entertainment venues. And a country that had no entertainment venues whatsoever now has hundreds of them. And then it's had, I think last year, it was some 6,500 entertainment type events that were allowed in the country, including watching movies. So he's definitely got change on his mind, and is very interesting character, Middle Eastern especially character in these last days. Now, here's something else that is a point of interest in relation to the Ezekiel scenario, and this comes from the Middle East Monitor. And the headline reads, Turkey and Russia consult on Syria and Libya. And there you've got Syria in the heart of this again. Turkish officials have met with their counterparts at the Russian Foreign Ministry in Moscow for consultations on the latest developments in Syria and Libya, two civil war-torn countries. According to the ministry, the delegations reaffirmed their commitment to the sovereignty, unity, and territorial integrity of Syria. And moreover, Moscow said, both sides expressed satisfaction with the implementation of the Russian-Turkish agreements aimed at maintaining the ceasefire in Syria and combating the presence of international terrorists on Syrian territory. And this would certainly apply to the Kurdish people, at least in the minds of the Turks. The delegations discussed preparations for the 16th International Meeting on Syria in the Astana format. They also exchanged views on ways to revitalize the Syrian political process, including the work of the Constitutional Committee in Geneva in accordance with the UN Security Council Resolution 2254. The Russian delegation was represented by Deputy Foreign Minister and Special Representative of the President of Russia for Middle East and Africa, Mikhail Bogdanov, and his Turkish counterpart, Sedat Onal, led Ankara's delegation. And during the discussion of the Libyan issue, progress was noted on the political, military, and economic tracks in the context of the work of the transitional, that's change, authorities in preparation for the 24th of December general election. And two parties agreed to maintain regular discussions on a set of issues to promote an early comprehensive settlement as well of the Libyan crisis. Now, this has been an interesting component of the Ezekiel war scenario. You'll find in many Bible translations the mention of Ethiopia. And in biblical times, Ethiopia just meant the land south of Egypt. Now, that would mean the Sudan in our day. And they are going to play a part in the Ezekiel war scenario. And Libya is named by its modern name, or its ancient name as well, Libya. So here you've got this relationship now between Russia, invading force in the Ezekiel scenario, Turkey, invading force in the Ezekiel war scenario, and they're communicating regarding Syria, which is the geographic location from which the invasion will take place, and they're concerned about Libya, who's going to join the coalition forces and march against Israel from the north. And as the King James Bible says, God is going to wipe out 5/6 of the invading armies, and they'll lay dead on the mountains of Israel. So in my mind, this is a pretty major development along with our previous story, where you've got Syria, who is not going to invade, Syria, who is not named in the Ezekiel war scenario, talking with the one protesting nation. And here you've got two of the leading factors in the invasion of Israel that's coming in, I believe, a not too distant future, working together to solve the Syrian crisis and the Libyan crisis. And Libya, as a result, at some point in time is going to engage in and participate in the military invasion from the north of Israel. Now, the Associated Foreign Press reports that Israel is reported to strike several cities across Syria. And remember, we mentioned in the last article that they're trying to control, that is, Russia and Turkey are trying to control terrorist forces within the boundaries of Israel. And while Russia has turned to a degree a blind eye about some of the inroads or the sorties that Israel has had into Damascus area and beyond, but obviously things are going to change, and they're going to side together against Israel. And that could already be behind the scenes what's taken place. But we're told an Israeli airstrike caused damage to sites in southern and central Syria late Tuesday, Damascus said, and the first attack was attributed to Israel in over a month. According to the Syrian state news agency SANA, air defense systems managed to shoot down some Israeli missiles, which were fired from the direction of Lebanon after 11:30 p.m. It said some missiles were shot down, others caused damage. One military source cited, but there were no casualties and material losses only. So again, we've had a lot of things happening, and obviously the 11-day exchange between Israel and the Palestinians in the Gaza Strip has taken front and center stage in the realm of world news and news pertaining to Israel. But this stress and anxiety between Israel and the events taking place on their northern border continues, even though there was a month-long pause. And who knows what's going to happen that's going to be the hook in the jaw to draw them down from the north. We know certainly energy-related products is going to take a role in the motivation, but what is going to be the catalyst? What is that one event that's going to be the catalyst that draws these invading forces in coalition already down from the north? Is it the destruction of Damascus, like Isaiah 17:1 prophesies, a standalone prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled? And yet it's in the news every day in the sense that Damascus, obviously, now being the capital of Syria, and Syria long being in the news because of their civil war. And now here you've got two of these stories with major players from the Ezekiel War scenario working together, and Israel still militarily active on their northern border to assure their own peace and safety, or their sense of security. Now, another story coming from the Middle East Monitor, and the headline reads, Hamas to the U.S. Israel has to end its occupation of Palestine. And Hamas yesterday condemned the latest remarks by U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken, in which he endorsed the Israeli occupations, as they put it, right to defend itself. Blinken gives the Israeli occupation a green light to continue its aggression on the Palestinian people, Hamas said in a statement. It's killing women and children, bombing homes over the heads of their residents, forcing Palestinians out of their homes in Jerusalem, and attacking the Al-Aqsa Mosque and journalists considered self-defense, they asked. Hamas stated that the occupier has no right to self-defense, but must end its occupation of the Palestinian territories and its aggression against our Palestinian people. And we know that because Jerusalem Day, the celebration of when Israel took control of the Temple Mount and the eastern half of Jerusalem, when that was on the horizon, the Palestinians rose up. Gaza started firing missiles at Israel. And of course, all the Palestinians are reporting is that Israel is the aggressor. They're harming and killing innocent people when they themselves fired over 4,000 rockets into civilian areas into Israel. And that's worth noting because there wasn't an attack on any of the military bases there in Israel. It was all weapons that were fired with the intention to do harm to the citizens of Israel, because to the Palestinian, the only good Israeli is a dead Israeli, and their desire is to see them driven into the sea and cease to exist. That's why the textbooks in Israeli or Palestinian schools don't show Israel existing on a world map. It simply doesn't acknowledge the right of the Israeli people to their ancient homeland. Now, here's something else that's of interest, and especially to me and others who have found themselves heavily censored because of comments made during the last election. And, it's kind of interesting that, I had a couple of things that got flagged on Facebook. That one, I reported an article from Johns Hopkins University about the fatality rate in 2020 in comparison to 2019. And, it was just a fact-based article that came again out of a very reputable medical university and hospital. And it got flagged. But what got me restricted on social media, what got my Facebook page restricted, was a sermon. And the sermon was titled Law and Grace. And it was a teaching right out of the book of Galatians. It had nothing to do with anything going on. But, because President Trump often used as one of his mantras that we're the party of law, we're the party of rule and order and decency and all the other things that he would often say. It got me restricted on Facebook. And as I mentioned yesterday in the update, some out of the couple 100,000 people that follow my Facebook page, 800 people were notified that we went live. So This is an interesting article. I'm glad to see Bloomberg Report standing up and saying something. And the headline reads, Facebook, YouTube erred in censoring COVID-19 misinformation. The lab leak theory is just the latest example of a COVID-19 idea that was prematurely debunked, the article says. Labeling misinformation online is doing more harm than good. And the possibility that COVID-19 came from a lab accident is just the latest example. Social media companies try to suppress any discussion of it for months, but why? There's no strong evidence against it, and evidence for other theories is still inconclusive. Pathogens have escaped from labs many times, and people have died as a result. And social media fact checkers don't have any special knowledge or ability to sort fact from misinformation. What they have is extraordinary power to shape what people believe. And stifling ideas can backfire if it leads people to believe there's a real story that's being suppressed. Misinformation is dangerous. It can keep people from getting life-saving medical treatments, including vaccines, the article says. But flagging it doesn't necessarily solve the problem. It's much better to provide additional information than to censor information. Part of the problem is that people think that they know information when they see it. And those most confident of their ability to spot it may be the least aware of their own biases. And that includes the fact-checking industry within the mainstream media, who were caught removing earlier posts on the lab leak theory, as well as social media fact-checkers who aren't accountable to the public. Now, this points us to the fact that we're hearing a lot about socialism and Marxism, and rightfully so, because we are experiencing potential precursors to that being the form of governance, even here in the land of the free and the home of the brave, very sadly. But this necessitates the control of the narrative. What people hear, it doesn't matter what the facts are, they're controlling what people hear and what, therefore, they believe. If you're fed the information, as you'll find even in the Rules for Radical, written by Saul Alinsky, he just says, continue to tell a lie and tell it loud and tell it often, and soon it will become believed and potentially even someday policy. So really, we've seen the social media, or big tech as they're called, controlling the narrative, controlling what it is that people hear, regardless of the facts, regardless of what has now come to light through the Fauci email release and all the other things. It's clearly possible that this was something that was manufactured or manipulated in the lab, or it could have, as they reported in the Bloomberg opinion piece, could have simply just escaped. The pathogen could have escaped. And I like the fact that they pointed out it's happened before and it's killed people before. So where's the misinformation, and where's the injustice and the infringement on people's thinking? You know, if you're simply stating something that's already taken place in the past, being the potential explanation of this pandemic we've all gone through. But the answer, really, in earnest, is the fact that they're controlling the narrative. They're controlling what it is that we hear. They're controlling the flow of information because they only want things that point in their direction to be heard, and heard frequently enough that it becomes that which is believed. Somebody made a comment I thought that was of interest in light of this type of thing going on in our world. And that is, it used to be people believed something because it was true. And in these days, things are true because people believe them, and including just fantasy things that are so ridiculous, like multiple genders and things of that nature, that are just being force-fed to younger and younger people, and it's become normalized in their thinking. And in that sense, we see the same group controlling the narrative in our school system. They began at the college level, moved down into the high schools, teaching errant biology and non-factual explanation, so to speak, for the origin of humankind and all living things for that matter. And now it's all the way down into the elementary and recent stories that they're trying to control the preschool level and what flow of information comes there too. So pretty interesting days that we live in. And, let me just pause for a moment, because we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the things happening in the world. And I'll explain why we need to talk about them here in a moment. But listen, somebody commented, I saw last week, that these things are very disheartening or saddening to them. listen, we need to recognize these things are things that the Bible said are going to be taking place in the last days, and that when we see them, we need to look up. We need to keep our focus and attention and our eyes on the prize, so to speak, because Jesus is coming to get us. And we're going to be out of here before the fulfillment of the ultimate fulfillment of the things that many of these stories are leading to, and some are even precursors to. So, listen, there's no reason for us to be in despair. Paul told Timothy in 2 Timothy 1:7 that God has not given us the spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind. So we can think soundly even in this age where our thoughts are trying to be controlled by those in places of power. We can keep our nose in the book, so to speak, and find answers in God's word. So there's nothing to be discouraged about, even though we can be disappointed in what's happening in any given country that is against the word of God. But again, the Bible told us this is how it's going to be in the last days. So another interesting story that I think will kind of move out into the fact that there are events taking place with the planet itself that have prophetic implications. And let me just mention that this first story, I don't think is a fulfillment of prophecy, but it does remind us of what Jesus said in his opening statements. I call it the preamble to the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24:3-8, where he talked about the fact that there would be certain basic life events that take place in an increasing fashion, much like birth pangs on a pregnant woman. And within them, he included seismos. Now, obviously the root for the word seismology, study of geologic events around the world, but the word in the Greek actually is not limited to the earth itself, but rather it can also mean a gale or a tempest. So there'll be atmospheric events as well as seismological events in the last days that are increasing in number. And this next story actually comes from AccuWeather. And the story says that tropical threat may brew by mid-June. Now, June 1 opens hurricane season and lasts until November. And the article says it's just week one into the 2021 Atlantic hurricane season. And meteorologists are watching the tropics with a particularly close eye on the waters surrounding Central America. AccuWeather forecasters say the potential exists for development of a tropical depression or storm, one that they've been scrutinizing for the past week, and chances will grow in middle to late June. A phenomenon known as the Central American Gyre is anticipated to develop in this area later this week and weekend. An atmospheric gyre is a large circular zone of lower air pressure that slowly spins. The Central American system can encompass thousands of square miles and sometimes overlap waters in the Western Caribbean and Eastern Pacific and even the southwestern part of the Gulf of Mexico. And this broad low-pressure zone typically makes it easier for clusters of drenching showers and thunderstorms to develop. So we're seeing these types of things every year, and there's been people who have forecasted a busier than usual Atlantic hurricane season, and we've seen this kind of ebb and flow within the past few years. But it does remind us that atmospheric events are going to be part of the tribulation scene, and there's going to be a lack of rain, which our next couple of stories are going to remind us of. But we have to remember that cataclysmic events are part of the last days scenario, and they too are going to ramp up, as will earthquakes. The normal course of life things are going to become more intense and more frequent during the last days. And this is what Jesus indicated in Matthew 24:3-8. Now, the next story comes from a website. The website's actually called The End of the American Dream. And the headline reads, "Are we getting closer to a major seismic event on the West Coast?" Are we getting closer? The article says, within the past several days, we've seen hundreds of earthquakes happen in Southern California. There have been large earthquakes offshore near the Cascadia subduction zone. And by the way, the Cascadia subduction zone, which runs up through the Seattle area and beyond and back out into the Pacific, is far more threatening and has greater potential for a great earthquake. Even some have speculated a magnitude 10.0, much more than the San Andreas Fault that runs through Southern California. and out into the desert. There's been a very alarming swarm of earthquakes at Mount Hood. We haven't seen this much seismic activity along the West Coast in quite a long time, and many are concerned that this could be leading up to something big. At this moment, scientists are carefully monitoring the area around the Salton Sea, and according to the U.S. Geological Survey, in one 24-hour period over the weekend, there were more than 600 earthquakes of at least a magnitude 1.0 that shook the area of Southern California. Now, geophysicist Randy Baldwin said 603 tremblers with a magnitude of at least 1 happened in the area from Saturday to just before sunrise on Sunday, and the number has now reached over 1,700. The article says the magnitude 5.3 was felt. A magnitude 5.3 was felt throughout the region. As a matter of fact, it's being reported as far as 95 miles away from the epicenter of the quake in Chula Vista, San Diego, El Centro, and Indio, California. And Saturday morning shaking could be felt in an apartment complex near Del Mar, California, 95 miles away from the location of the quake. Now, we do know there's going to be earthquakes that take place during the tribulation period, including the great quake, so to speak, of Revelation 16, one that there has not been since there have been humans on the earth, is how it is described, the biggest quake in the history of the world's existence. So, again, seeing these types of things, and listen, I'm a native Californian. I grew up here, was born here, been hearing about earthquakes my whole life, been through many earthquakes that have happened here, heard about the big one my whole life, and, we don't know exactly when this type of thing is going to take place, but it serves as a reminder that the earth, according to Romans 8, is groaning and travailing, and it too seeks deliverance from the fallen state of mankind and the Eden-like environment that's going to be restored when Jesus' feet again touch down on the Mount of Olives. Now, here's another interesting story, and it has to do with atmospheric type events, which would include rainfall, as well as meteors and all those other kind of things. And this comes from News Dakota. And the headline reads, drought conditions favorable for toxic cyanobacteria. And cyanobacteria, also known as the blue-green algae, can produce toxins that are harmful to livestock, wildlife, and people. The growth of this bacteria is accelerated by high temperatures, and the hot, dry conditions we're experiencing are perfect for the production of cyanobacteria, says Miranda Nehan, North Dakota State University Extension Livestock Environmental Stewardship Specialist. I don't know how she fit that on a business card. That's a big title. Much of the state is at an increased risk due to the widespread drought affecting 99% of the state. And given the current conditions, producers and the public should be on the lookout for cyanobacteria blooms. A blue-green algae often occurs in stagnant ponds or dugouts with elevated nutrient levels, forming large colonies that appear as scum or just below the water surface. And live cyanobacteria blooms can be green, but also red or yellow, and often turn blue after the bloom dies and dries on the water surface or shoreline. And some species of the cyanobacteria can be toxic when livestock and wildlife ingests them, and toxicity is dependent on the species consuming the water, as well as the concentration of toxin or toxins, and the amount of water ingested. Now, we know that a good portion of the tribulation period is not going to rain. And we also know that there's going to be a food shortage during the tribulation period. Under the opening of the seven seals, we see that basically it's a day's pay for a quart of wheat or barley, which is basically the equivalent to a loaf of bread. And we also see there in Revelation chapter 6, the beasts of the earth killing and the murder of humans from hand-to-hand combat and things of that nature. And a lot of this hinging upon the fact that people are starving and the food supply has been greatly diminished. There's another interesting story that parallels this. It came actually out of the Washington Post, and the article headline reads, as grocery prices rise, alt meat takes a bigger bite of Big Meat's burger. The price of plant-based proteins such as Impossible Burger and Beyond Meat, vegetarian alternatives to burgers and sausages, have fallen in the past year, leading to more people trying them. Then the pandemic hit, restaurants closed, and many Americans were stuck at home battling anxiety and sourdough starters. Industry experts wondered whether enthusiasm for this new food category would falter and sales lag. Would plant-based meat turn out to be a fad rather than a movement? Things look grim. Last April, plant-based protein shipments to restaurants fell 27%, according to market research group NPD. However, the article says it appears that those worries were ill-founded. Alt meat has emerged stronger than ever, much because of one thing, and that is price. Myriad pandemic pressures upended the pricing formulas for both traditional meat and plant-based proteins, making alt meat a more competitive choice at the grocery store far more quickly than any expert could have predicted. It used to be that plant-based proteins generated a ton of hype and heady righteousness for health-oriented and environmentally focused consumers, yet a pound of ground Impossible Burger was still way more than double than even the fanciest of ground beefs, making this new generation of faux meat a reach for the cost-conscious cook. But prices are dropping. Now, interesting that we see this particular story in that we're talking about the things that are going to happen in the atmosphere. We're talking about the fact that things are going to dry up, so to speak, and through an asteroid strike and a comet strike during the tribulation period, all the grass is going to be burned up. And again, when you're using plant-based materials to generate your food supply, and you've got, the beasts of the earth killing one another, rampant starvation around the world, and then even this particular market is impacted by what's going to happen during the tribulation, we should be thankful we're not going to be here, and we should try and rescue as many souls as humanly possible with God's help through the preaching of the gospel so that they won't go through these things. And I think another story from Bloomberg will remind us that the world's food supply, according to this article, has never been more vulnerable. And they're citing a story we talked about last week where a cyber attack crippled the world's largest meat producer, JBS. And the meat plants have begun to reopen across the globe, but the meat industry shouldn't be returning to business as usual. For the security of our food supply, the Biden administration needs to make sure that it doesn't. And the JBS subversion, which has been attributed to a Russian-linked cyber criminal group, was the latest in a series of black swan events that have crippled large-scale meat producers in recent years. The March 2019 fire in Holcomb, Kansas, destroyed a Tyson food plant that processed about 5% of U.S. beef. In April 2020, a major hog and chicken processing plant nationwide became COVID-19 hotspots, causing cascading shutdowns that included a Smithfield Foods plant processing more than 15% of all pork in the U.S. And last week's JBS attack sabotaged more than 1/5 of all U.S. beef processing in a matter of minutes. It reminded us of a glaring truth we already knew. Consolidation has made the U.S. meat industry and the global protein supply profoundly and unacceptably vulnerable, and it will become more susceptible in the years ahead as public health threats and potential cyber attacks continue to loom large, and as climate change increases, the risk of natural disasters like drought, like they're having in the Dakotas, heat, flooding, wildfires, insect superstorms, and weather volatility are raising pressure on our farms and ranches. In short, the cost-saving benefits of agricultural consolidation are increasingly outweighed by the risk of destruction. And again, we talked last week about the fact that there is going to be a role for technology in the last days scenario. I've always found it interesting that in the midst of all the things that we see in modern weaponry, we see very basic, almost archaic weaponry mentioned in the invasion of Israel. You've got shields and bucklers, kind of old school battle armaments. You've got, in Revelation 16, you've got the necessity of the drying up of the Euphrates River in order for armies from the east to cross over and invade into Israeli territory and other issues, whatever they're going to be during the tribulation period. Now, listen, in the mechanized weaponry age, you don't need a river to dry up to invade another country. You just send in the drones or your aircraft, or you even fire surface-to-air missiles and all the other things that we're well aware of. But if there's a major hack or a geomagnetic storm that strikes the Earth. We just had one, by the way, and it did disrupt communication systems on June 8th around the world, though it be briefly. And, there have been some internet disruptions that have been blamed on a hack, including some in political positions in Washington had access denied to certain things over that period of time. So it's kind of interesting that we had notification that there was going to be a large coronal mass ejection that happened, and the 48 to 52 hours for these negatively charged ions to arrive on the Earth would land on June 8th and disrupt communication and satellite processing and all that other stuff. And sure enough, we had it. So it could be a major, what they would call a G5 geomagnetic, a class 5 geomagnetic storm that could just basically disrupt all processing systems of anything, information, meat processing, the grocery store, all the things we talked about last time that send us back into the previous millennia and a couple of centuries back. So interesting to see these types of things being considered by places like Bloomberg. And The Guardian says, amid the mega drought, right-wing militia stokes water rebellion in the U.S. and fears of a confrontation between law enforcement and right-wing militia supporters over the control of water in drought-stricken American West have sparked protests in Klamath Falls in Oregon. Protesters affiliated with the right-wing anti-government activist Ammon group, basically Bundy's People's Rights Network, Ammon Bundy's People's Rights Network, are threatening to break a deadlock over water management in the area by unilaterally opening the head gates of a reservoir. The protest has reawakened memories not only of recent standoffs with federal agencies, including the one led by Bundy in Eastern Oregon in 2016, but a longer history of anti-government agitation in Southern Oregon and Northern California stretching back to 2000 and beyond. Now, again, this points to what we're going to see, or we're not going to see it again, thankfully, but what's going to take place during the tribulation period, where people are killing each other over the food supply, and a simple quart of wheat or a loaf of bread is going to cost a day's pay. And now we live in a different climate. We don't live in the Depression era type of climate where people would casually and patiently stand in a soup line to get a piece of bread and a bowl of soup in order to keep from starving. We've got people with a different outlook and a different mentality today. And even though that's not unusual, there's always been people who are willing to fight for what they think is rightfully theirs in the course of human history. But the group has grown in recent years. And there are many today who simply, again, have that attitude that they're done allowing the government to control every aspect of their life. So, again, the drought and water supply is paired with unrest and agitation within the community. Now, we also know that during the last days that there's going to be a defection from truth. Paul told that to the church at Thessaloniki, that there would be an apostasia, a defection from truth. Paul mentioned it in 2 Timothy chapter 4 as well, that there's going to be a time that comes where sound doctrine will not be endured. And this article comes from the Dissenter, and it's about World Vision, helps group that is, many have sponsored children through World Vision over the years. And the headline reads, World Vision training course says Native Americans shouldn't have to repent from idolatry. And World Vision, which used to be a charity organization, the article says, to help fight poverty around the world, has become now nothing more than another woke organization advocating for the destruction of Christianity and its influence and the continuance of ethnocentric pagan idolatry. World Vision has a series of online training courses where they promote these progressive and Marxist ideas by employing non-white racial instigators to demean biblical Christianity and Western culture that was born out of it. In one video, a Native American talks about how Christians from Western Europe brought Christianity to America and destroyed the Native Americans' covenant with God. This guy says that all the different ethnic groups had their own covenants with God, which of course is blasphemy, and that none of these groups, including Native Americans, needed to repent of their pagan practices because they were already close enough to Christianity. Interestingly, he says the only thing they lacked was the knowledge of Christ. Well, if you lack the knowledge of Christ, you lack everything. That is the only thing that can save your soul. Now, our last story for the day, Gallup reports that there's a record high of 70% in the United States who support same-sex marriage. U.S. support for legal same-sex marriage continues to trend upward, now at 70%, a new high in Gallup's trend since 1996. And the latest figure marks an increase of 10 percentage points since 2015, when the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that all states must recognize same-sex marriages. Today, 70% for same-sex marriage marks that new milestone in this trend that has pointed upward for a quarter century. A small minority of Americans, 27%, supported legal recognition of gay and lesbian marriages in 1996 when Gallup first asked the question. But support rose steadily over time, eventually reaching the majority level for the first time in 2011. And by the time the Supreme Court's Obergefell versus Hodges decision in 2015, support for gay marriage had reached 60%. And since then, the issue has been less prominent in U.S. politics, and public support for same-sex marriage has continued to increase. Interesting that this is the first ordinance that God gave to humankind, that a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. I was talking with our staff at the church yesterday, and it just seems like that mankind has moved as far upstream as you can go. They've defied everything that God has initiated and instituted for our well-being and for the benefit of humanity, including now all the way back up to marriage, as he ordained and instituted at creation. Well, they denied that he's a creator, so why would they pay attention to any of his ordinances? So that's it for today's lineup, and hope you were informed and made aware of some of the things going on around the world. Some of them simply newsworthy, some of them, as I said, reminders. But let me ask and encourage you again, make sure you share this video so others can get some fact-based news and things that aren't fact-checked by people that can't tell facts from fiction. And also, I would encourage you and ask you to make sure that you would go to our YouTube page, look under my name, Barry Stagner, or you can look under The Truth About God, and you can simply subscribe there. And please make sure you hit the notifications bell so you're made aware of things that will pop up during the week and days ahead as they relate to Bible prophecy and any announcements we have towards upcoming events. So again, this has been The Lineup, and I'm Barry Stagner, wishing you a very blessed week, and Lord willing, we'll see you next time.